It's my great pleasure to introduce her. And Talya, welcome to Sarasota.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Susan. Okay. I just have a question for, if I'm going to, can you hear me now? No, louder, please. Much louder? Good, okay. I also will be showing some PowerPoint, so do we want to bring the light down a little bit in the back? Great. Oh, there we go. Okay, I guess we don't need to bring it down too much. Okay, it is really a delight to be here. It's an honor for me to be here. I thank Professor Marks. I thank New College. And everything I have seen so far really impresses me greatly. So you're fortunate to be living in a place where the intellectual and cultural riches are what they are. At the heart of this talk is a riddle that may already have occurred to you. According to rabbinic tradition, when Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai, he simultaneously received the oral Torah. But in fact, this is what the oral Torah looks like. Right? Nowadays, one can encounter the so-called oral Torah in miles of bookshelves filled with printed Hebrew and Aramaic books. The treasury of rabbinic literature includes compilations of Midrash, Mishnah, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, legal codes, commentaries and digests of all of the above, and responsa, rabbinic answers to questions posed. This mammoth library also grows every year as new works are composed. So in what sense is this oral Torah? The first thing to be said is that until the millennium, around the year 1000 of the Common Era, rabbinic traditions really were relayed through oral transmission, even though written versions existed as crib notes for jogging the memory. But why were the above-mentioned corpora preserved in memory and imparted through face-to-face transmission? When did rabbinic communities shift to the textual transmission of tradition, and why did they do so? What were the consequences of this shift? I will explore these and other questions by focusing specifically on the Babylonian Talmud. For more than any other body of rabbinic teachings, it is this corpus that has come to be iconically associated with Jewish identity. What is the Babylonian Talmud? It's the one on the right, I guess you see. It is a corpus of 63 tractates which comment on an earlier corpus of rabbinic teachings. That work on the left, the Mishnah, consists of 6 orders written in Hebrew in Palestine, in Roman Palestine. The Mishnah preserves rabbinic teachings of the 1st and 2nd centuries, and it was compiled around the year 200. The Babylonian Talmud, written in Aramaic, preserves the conversations of rabbis who lived under Persian rule in the environs of what is now Baghdad between the years 200 and 500 of the Common Era. Though mistakenly portrayed as a compilation of Jewish law, the Babylonian Talmud is hardly that. It contains inspirational homilies. It relates anecdotes about sages, some quite unflattering. It contains tall tales. Some of these may encode allusions to oppressive government and the imminent downfall that the Jews hoped for. Most strikingly, the voluminous legal material that it preserves is preserved in the form of unresolved disputes. Rabbi X said A, but Rabbi Y said B. Okay, this is quintessential quarreling sages. Notwithstanding its copiousness, the Talmud, built on the underlying Mishnah, was truly transmitted in oral form, probably up through the 10th century, as I said before. This may seem hard to believe because we moderns are wedded to texts and to textual transmission, even if we now access our textual information electronically. More importantly, we're not familiar with the many mnemonic strategies that were essential to pedagogy in antiquity and the Middle Ages. The high value that was placed on memorization is alien to us. The best way in which I can telegraph the ideal of pre-modern cultures is by sharing a Greek aphorism, making allowances for its gendered language. Oh, wrong one. This is the aphorism, more or less. The only wisdom that a man truly possesses is that which he takes with him into the bath. The learning that is of greatest value in life is that which one has internalized. This is the knowledge that one can recall and apply in life, even when one has no access to books or to the internet. For this reason, pre-modern education placed a premium on memorizing the wisdom of those who came before. An educated person was one who could call to mind, recall, the apt guidance whenever it was needed. Concrete schoolroom exercises were designed to inculcate skill in mnemonic imprintation, right? How do you be sure that you're going to remember something? And agility in retrieval. To understand what I mean by retrieval, just think about the process of looking up a word in the dictionary. This current undergraduates, you don't count in this one, right? Think about the process of looking up a word in the dictionary. When you were little and you wanted to find out the meaning of a word, say, starting with J, you first had to remind yourself where J falls within the sequence of the alphabet, and then you would sing A, B, C, D, right? You had to do that first, but later you more or less knew where to open the book. Right? That's because you had already acquired some agility in manipulating the data that you had. I said undergraduates are excused because you can just type in the beginning letter, et cetera, right? Okay, like other educational programs in antiquity and the Middle Ages, Jewish pedagogy stressed internalization of the sage's wisdom, for a living repository of tradition would model his or her life accordingly. Discipleship, a crucial feature of oral transmission, smoothed the way for masters to determine what should be done in legal situations which the Talmudic disputes left unresolved. As living links in the chain of tradition, the masters could authoritatively declare how the law was to be applied in practice. Halacha lema'aseh, we would say. For the masters had observed the proper implementation in the behavior of their own teachers. So even if the Talmud left a particular matter unresolved, there was a memory and actually a visual witness to the way that one was supposed to do it. Beyond this, the oral transmission of law preserved a measure of flexibility that facilitated tradition's adaptation to new circumstances. Had the foremost source of authority been a text, change would have been noticed as a deviation, right? You know that you're doing something and you check the text and it's not right. There's no coherence, there's discord between them. At best, if that happened, the text would require reinterpretation in order to bring it into line with the practice that you knew to be true. This benefit of oral communication brings to mind the well-known Supreme Court practice of oral argumentation. During this process, the justices pose hypothetical questions in order to gauge the practical ramifications of a decision being considered and to discern the limits of its applicability. Oral give and take allows for a dynamic, even a kinetic probing of the material at hand, and it steers clear of the ossification that comes with the written formulation of law. A final, ideologically tinged reason for preserving the orality of rabbinic teachings should be mentioned. This one contrasts the written Torah, that is, the 24 books of the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible, with the post-biblical and oral rabbinic teachings. The narrative that I'm about to relay emerged in the 4th century at a time when Christianity had become the official religion of the Holy Roman Empire. According to a rabbinic midrash of this time, which is repeated in various medieval Jewish sources, God deliberately gave the Jewish people an oral Torah alongside the written Torah because God, foresaw that other peoples would usurp the one that was written, the Hebrew Bible, and claim it as their own. At the end of days, goes the midrash, as God readies himself to bestow the ultimate reward, he will ask, "Who are my children?" Other nations of the world will come forward and produce the written Torah as evidence of their filial status. But only Israel will be able to produce God's hidden treasure, the oral Torah, whose very mode of transmission shielded it from Christian takeover. When Israel would produce this evidence in the future, concludes the Midrash, God would be able to recognize his own. Well, that's a pretty strong theme. Given the pedagogic value of oral learning and the cultural cachet and the theological benefits of oral transmission, we must then ask why the Babylonian Talmud, among other corpora of oral Torah, was ultimately and after many centuries transmitted as a written text. The picture that I'm about to present is the result of reasoned speculation. There is no concrete documentary evidence that definitively answers this question. Perhaps as early as the 7th century, scholars known as Gaonim, or eminences, who presided over post-Talmudic academies, were both the curators of the locally produced Babylonian Talmud and its disseminators. So there's Baghdad, so it's Iran, Iraq, and we say the Babylonian Talmud, this would have been called Mesopotamia, this area, and that's where the Babylonian Talmud was produced over the course of 3 centuries. And then once it had been produced and was, let's say, brought to a close, which is a very interesting topic in and of itself, the post-Talmudic academies were established in Baghdad, which was itself a new city, established only in 750 as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, right, under Islamic rule. So these Gaonim were the curators and the disseminators of the corpus of tradition that had been produced in this same area. But at a time when the Babylonian Talmud was not yet a household name, and Jews were more familiar with Torah, Midrashic legends, and the Mishnah, the Gaonim taught Talmud to students from across the diaspora who came to the academies in Baghdad for month-long conclaves twice a year. Where did they come from? Here's Baghdad. They came from because of the they came from Spain. They came from the kingdom of the Franks. They came from Italy. They came from Tunisia, from the community of Kairouan. They came from Egypt. They came from Jerusalem. So some of them were really coming very long distances. As I said, they stayed a month, and then they went back. We don't really know whether the people who came in the month of Elul also came in the month of Adar. We just don't know that yet, or perhaps we may never know. During these sessions in the academies, the Gaonim composed answers to questions of law that had been posed to them, and they interpreted passages which Jews had presented as problematic. Those writings are called the responsa, and they are merely some of the earliest rabbinic answers to specific questions posed. Because the answers drew heavily on Talmud, the responsa themselves helped to broadcast the authority of the Babylonian Talmud, right? In other words, if the answers rely on this corpus that the Jews over here didn't know too much about yet, clearly this Babylonian Talmud was something of great importance. Yet strikingly, medieval Gaonim, and that's from about the 7th to the 11th centuries, they observed an ancient rabbinic taboo against inscribing oral traditions, and they carefully guarded the divide between written and oral Torah. While individual students did inscribe orally transmitted traditions as private jottings, these had no official or authoritative status. It's kind of like your shopping list, right? You write down what you need to get, but nobody should infer anything particularly important from that data. It just is there to jog your memory. The only authorized version of oral Torah from the 7th, certainly to the 10th centuries, was the one that was truly oral, that was learned by heart in a living encounter with a Gaonic master. Over the course of time, rabbinic communities far from Baghdad came into their own. Okay? Again, we're talking Al-Andalus, which came under the rule of Muslims in 711, and we're talking about the Frankish kingdom or the Carolingian Empire. We're talking about parts of Italy and very much this North African, both Kairouan and Fez, which is more like over there. These are rather important centers in the Gaonic period. I wouldn't say that the European ones are all that important, but they're nascent. So over the course of time, rabbinic communities located far from Baghdad came into their own, and their inhabitants ceased to rely on the scholars of the East. 10th and 11th century Jews of Kairouan in today's Tunisia, and in Al-Andalus, right, southern Spain, and the Rhineland, that's the Rhone, the Rhineland is there, and Provence, southern France, there we go, and northern France and southern Italy. All the Jews living in these areas showed reverence for the Gaonim. But the vast geographic distances, the slow pace and unreliability of the mail, and the cultivation of local rabbinic talent, and also, I would say, the fact that the conditions in each of these particular lands were so different politically, economically, that it was very hard to assume that people living far away knew how to tailor their response to one's own circumstances. All these different factors led to the attenuation of Western Jewry's dependence on scholars of the East. The decline of the Gaonate was also closely related to the demise of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and to the flourishing of the Umayyad Caliphate, whose headquarters were in Cordoba and Al-Andalus. That is, in short, the growing encounter with the Babylonian Talmud as a written text went hand in hand with the rise of the Western centers of rabbinic Judaism beginning in the 10th century. Right? That was the only, if the masters were living here and they were sending, and manuscripts were coming this way, or actually this way, then they didn't have masters over here. They were relying on the text itself. Still, between the 10th and 13th centuries, the nature of the encounter with the written Talmud continued to differ from one place to the next. And these differences, among others, can still be discerned in the division of Jews into subcultures like Sepharad and Ashkenaz. These particular subcultural designations, along with other regionally constituted Jewish identities that are probably less well known to American audiences, these subcultures all have their origin in the Middle Ages. Discrete subcultures of Jews developed different patterns of Talmud study and different patterns of legal decision-making that bear certain resemblances to the dominant culture and societies in which they were located. Surprise. This presentation explores the changing place of the Babylonian Talmud in the lands of Ashkenaz, which I'm going to say starts out being the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne. That's kind of Franco-Germany. Let's leave it at that, even though, of course, today we think of Ashkenaz as Germany, and then we think of it as Ashkenaz as spreading into the lands where the emigres or the refugees from the Germanic principalities fled, particularly in the 15th century, into Poland and further into Eastern Europe. So the changing role of Talmud in Sfarad, let's say technically is, and this is going to be a little strange, but it's not only Al-Andalus, it's also the North Africa. Okay? It's not what most people think, and I'm speaking here about, let's say, the 10th and 11th centuries. Right? Nowadays, I'm sure not everybody would agree with that designation, but it's pretty precise for this period. So it's a very interesting story of what happened to the Talmud in Sfarad, but that's not the story I'm going to tell here. But I do want to at least sketch out 3 major points very broadly, in case this will give you the contours of why the study of Talmud was so different, or the relationship of Jews to the Talmud was so different in Sfarad than in Ashkenaz. 1, 3 points. The earliest Sephardi communities evolved in the precise environments where the reach of Roman law and its culture could still be felt. Look at this. So here's Rome, and this is part of Rome, this is part of Rome, this is part of Rome. Okay? And the Roman legal culture was heavily reliant upon the written word. Okay? So legal culture, there's documentary evidence counted for a great deal within Rome. I'm going to get to this, but just so you see, this area, at the height of the Roman Empire, this was the frontier land, and even though the administration of the Roman Empire was felt at the frontier land of the Germanic kingdoms, those people had not lived under Roman law for centuries, as had the people here, and of course here. Okay, point 2. The earliest Sephardi communities evolved in the very environments and in the precise period when written Islamic law was being formulated. Okay? And the third point, and this is that all 3 major codes of Jewish law, they are the Mishneh Torah, 12th century Maimonides or Rambam, the 14th century Tur by Yaakov ben Asher, and who compiled it in Castile, and the Shulchan Aruch, Maimonides did his work in Egypt. Yaakov ben Asher compiled the Tur in 14th century Castile, and Rabbi Yosef Karo compiled the Shulchan Aruch, or Shulchan Aruch, some of you may know, in 16th century Safed. Every single one of those places is a place of Sephardi influence, right? The Ashkenazim did not produce codes of law, the Sephardim did. And I think this is part of this larger picture of relying on and valuing written law. Okay, let's go back to our main story. In short, and this is embarrassingly reductive, the Jews of Sfarad were primed both by the lasting legacy of Rome and by the burgeoning legal culture of Islam to regard authoritative law as written law. And for this reason, I would argue, they recognized the written text of the Babylonian Talmud as a source of legal authority from the very time that they encountered it. By contrast, the Jews of early Ashkenaz, again, right, related to the written text of the Talmud in a manner much more akin to that of their Gaonic predecessors of the East, the rabbinic masters in the 10th and 11th century classrooms of the Rhineland transmitted Talmudic and other traditions orally. And in those towns, Speyer, Mainz, Worms, the etiquette of discipleship prevailed. Beyond this, the broader cultural environment reinforced the sense that law was not derived from texts. The early Ashkenazic settlements were located in Germanic lands that had once been on the fringe of the Roman Empire and that were subsequently overrun by barbarian invasions. By the time the Jews settled there in the 10th century, the Christian inhabitants were still governed by their respective tribal laws: Salic, Burgundian, Saxon, Bavarian, Lombardian, right? The legal and administrative practices in these Germanic lands relied heavily on the spoken word, accompanied by gestures and props. After the Roman Empire's decline, right, early 5th century, these one-time frontier lands reverted to earlier practices, and they brought into being changes of legal status, like freeing a slave, manumission, marriage, acquisition of property. All those acts require or entail the change in legal status. So any one of these types of acts they were not affected through the signing of contracts, they were affected through the performance of rituals that were witnessed by the public. I'm going to move ahead even though, okay, this is from the Sachsenspiegel of the 13th century, or Sachsenspiegel, correctly. It's hard to see, and I'm not sure that I can interpret. I'll try to interpret at least one of them, one of these pictures. Let me get up to that, and then we'll turn to the Sachsenspiegel. So these ceremonies, and here you see different types of legal acts being enacted with, as you see, gesture and prop. Okay, let's see. This obviously is somebody who's royal, and this is some kind of a prop. I mean, I could do a lot better job than I'm doing right now had I done my homework better, but this is somebody kneeling in obeisance. These different markings correspond to there is a written text which says, and these are coins. It may be that some of you will be able to do a good job interpreting, but you can see things being exchanged and somewhat symbolic props being used. Let's see. This one is one that I know at least, okay? Here you see kind of a fork or a yoke around the neck of a king, and it's being held by a queen or at least a long-haired other monarch who's engaging in some kind of exchange. I don't know what this is, and I should know what that is. But this is obviously a sign of obedience. You belong to me, right? So if, let's say, I'm spinning my wheels right now, so please don't take this too seriously, but assuming that one noble person acquired another noble person because his army had overrun that of the first, had overrun that of the second, the actual ritual of obeisance, of pledging obedience to the overlord, was actually acted out. And this whole, I don't know what this is about, but this certainly is not royalty, and again, we have to learn what this is. But again, this corresponds to some written text. I don't know what this is either, but it's clearly what we would say semiotically laden. There are a lot of signs here, and those who know how to decode them can decode them. Now, this whole thing is being witnessed by the public, and especially by children, okay? Ceremonies and spectacles accompanied legal events such as the sale or transfer of property, the manumission of servants, marriage, and this is reflected in German codes. And there are other editions of the Sachsenspiegel. This one happens to be from Dresden, but there are other Germanic codes where you can see comparable acts being enacted. In this region, custom, a source of authority vested in ancient practice and in the recitation of oral formulae, was the preeminent source of law. This is not to say that there was no documentary evidence, but written contracts were regarded as less authoritative than custom. The public was the source of customs binding power, just as the public was the means for customs enforcement. When status-changing events were marked, it was essential that children be present to witness the ritual spectacles rich in action and in auditory and visual stimuli. If questions or doubts arose long after the transaction had taken place, the durability of the legal record was preserved even without documentary evidence, because the events, all of which carried meaning, the specific props, the specific formulae, the postures, all these had left lasting mnemonic impressions, memorial impressions, and people who were older could recall to mind the carefully staged acts that they had witnessed in their youth. And that's how law was transmitted through custom, through practice, and by relying on human memories. Because the legal culture of early medieval Northern Europe was built on a foundation of custom, and it was enacted through richly textured rituals that were performed in public, there was no history of appreciation for written authority in this region, or legal authority. The perception of written documents as sources of authority came about gradually in the lands of Northern Europe. The most notable period of this cultural shift was the late 11th and 12th centuries. The process of, quote, textualization that I will be describing refers to far more than the act of committing formerly oral teachings to written form. It also is not about the growth of literacy, which may but need not be a corollary. The textualization process refers to a shift in mentality, mentalité, right, that occurred as local societies and cultures came to attribute greater authority to written documents than they accorded to oral testimonies and evidentiary artifacts. I'm going to go over that in a second. Because the textualization of medieval Northern Europe was theologically neutral, akin perhaps to a shift in technology, this process affected every aspect of Jewish life and culture in medieval Ashkenaz. A finding from medieval England beautifully illustrates the impact of the textualization process by comparing the relative legal weights of concurrent sources of authority. So here's the comparison, which I'm drawing from the historian M.T. Clancy in a really wonderful book. He said, two parties come to a court of arbitration in England in the 11th century. Each party claims that a particular plot of land belongs to him. They bring different types of evidence in support of their claims. Litigant A brings with him a document, a written document, and he says before the court of arbitration, this document was signed with an X by my grandfather when he purchased it from its previous owner. Litigant B says, I have no document, but I have with me two bits of evidence. I have with me an old man who witnessed the transfer of this property to my family when he was a child. And I've also brought, it could be a sword, or it could be a hoe or a plow. We probably can, a plow, let's say, or a hoe. I've brought with me a hoe which was transferred from the previous owner to my grandfather. And the court of arbitration lets the old man speak, and the old man says, well, when I was a child, I saw that this hoe was passed from the previous owner to this man's grandfather, and the following formulation was recited. These are the contest. According to evidence, which I'm relying on from others, in the 11th century court of arbitration, litigant B would have had the stronger case. By the time you get to the 12th century, litigant A has the stronger case. This is what I mean about textualization being a process in the course of which a whole society comes to place greater authority in the written word than in other forms of evidence. Okay, that's a huge shift. Okay, turning back to the Jews, the major agents of the textualization process in medieval Northern Europe were Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki of northern France. He was a Frenchman and his grandsons, who were called the Tosafists. I'll explain that in a minute. One of the most famous Tosafist is his grandson, Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, these guys, he and his students he's 12th century, his students are 12th century and 13th century, and of course you see Rashi's dates. Oh, this date belongs over there. Sorry about that. Okay. Taken collectively, the projects that this guy and his grandsons, let's use him as the most important, which he was, they did things with the Talmud. They created certain Talmudic projects, which I'm going to describe, and they were the ones who were really responsible for transforming the Babylonian Talmud into something which it had never been before. A semantically comprehensible, I'll decode this soon, semantically comprehensible, internally consistent text, regarded as the preeminent source of Jewish legal authority. Before the First Crusade in 1096, with its devastating consequences for Jews, of the Rhineland in particular, Rashi had studied with the foremost rabbinic scholars of Speyer, Mainz, and Worms, those towns along the Rhine, in academies that were characterized by the ethos of discipleship, by the memorization of traditions, and by oral face-to-face exchanges between the master and the student. When Rashi returned to northern France before the First Crusade, he committed these largely oral teachings to writing, and he disseminated them in the form of a running commentary on much of the Babylonian Talmud. By the way, and this, if you've heard of Rashi, you've probably more likely to have heard of him as the foremost Bible commentator. He did the same thing for the Bible. Here, too, his knowledge was acquired in the Rhineland academies where oral modes of teaching were privileged. So Rashi's commentary on the Talmud was revolutionary in its day, and it remains indispensable to this day for studying the Talmud's telegraphic text. Meaning that if you don't have a tradition, a lens of tradition through which you're reading the Talmud, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. There's a lot missing there. It's very staccato, okay? Even if you rely on the Soncino translation, the Steinsaltz translation, that's already an interpretation, okay? The Talmudic words themselves don't all fit together as neatly as we need in order to fully understand. Okay, so Rashi's commentary did several of the following things, or did these following things. Rashi's comments offer connective tissue that transforms these utterances, these telegraphic utterances, into understandable locutions. Rashi's comments offer translations of arcane Talmudic terms that were no longer understood, whether they were in Aramaic or Greek or in Persian. And they were translated by him into the vernacular French, to Old French. And you can actually spell it out. And in fact, this has been a resource for linguists or for students of Old French to understand how it was pronounced, how certain words were pronounced, because it's written in a different script. And so if you see it spelled out in Hebrew letters, then you actually know how it was pronounced in the French. It's an interesting sideline. There's one other thing that Rashi did that I'm going to illustrate by way of one of my favorite didactic jokes. And that's that he told students readers of the Talmud how to punctuate it. So here's my joke. I'm sure somebody here knows this joke and whatever, but it's the joke about what's happening at the first Bolshevik Congress, and everybody and all the comrades are there and they're cheering their Bolshevik leaders, and in comes, I gotta do this, let's see, telegram, right? That's just to remind some of us what a telegram is. And in comes a messenger, and he comes up to the podium and he says, I have a message here from, who was exiled in Cuba? From Trotsky. I have a message here from Comrade Trotsky, who was a Menshevik, and he says, I was wrong, you were right, I should apologize. And everybody goes, whoa! And then a lone Menshevik comes up and says, I'm sorry, you're not reading that correctly. It says, I was wrong? You were right? I should apologize? Okay, that's what the Talmud is. You have no idea how to inflect unless you have a living master telling you. I mean, some of you have heard, right? You've heard that kind of Talmudic inflections, but you really have to know whether it's a statement, an affirmation, an expression of astonishment, and it makes all the difference in the world if you don't have that kind of punctuation to guide you. Okay, Rashi's commentary on the Babylonian Talmud spread rapidly, and its circulation made it possible for literate Jews the world over to homeschool themselves. But under these new conditions, the very Jews who became learned without studying at the feet of a living embodiment of tradition also came to rely exclusively on the text to guide them. Logic was the most effective tool they could wield in unpacking the Talmud's riddles, and recourse to lived experience came to count for less and less. It was under these circumstances that Rashi's French grandsons and their French and German students undertook their own commentaries on the Talmud in the late 12th and 13th centuries, known as the Tosafot. We saw Rabbeinu Tam, or additions, right, from the word lahosif, right? Or additions. These comments offered explanatory glosses or commentaries both on Rashi's commentary and on the Talmud itself. The Tosafists' panoptic approach, meaning they took in the whole thing as a whole because they too had memorized it, they were of that era, was built on an assumption that was held by Rashi. Regarding the entire Talmud as a unified and internally coherent corpus, the Tosafists put scaffolding in place that would enable students reading the Talmud to compare and contrast related utterances that occur throughout this vast corpus. That means you no longer need to call to mind that the same issue is discussed in a different tractate, because they would bring it up in their commentary, and suddenly you could compare without knowing the whole thing in your head. Identifying textual parallels, they created a comprehensive system of cross-referencing long before pagination was standardized. Please, these are all manuscripts. The Tosafists also drew attention to seeming contradictions between Talmudic passages, and they resolved them by means of dialectical reasoning. What I mean by dialectical reasoning in the case of the Tosafists is sort of like saying, well, it looks like there's a contradiction between case A and case B, but if you really look at the contexts, you'll realize that in case A, they were specifically speaking about an event which took place in the public domain, whereas in case B, it was the private domain. I just made that off the top of my head, but any number of other factors might be brought forward to account for why the Talmud seemed to be contradicting itself. And ultimately, these were acts of harmonization that made the Jews reading the Talmud with the commentary of the Tosafists able to see that the Talmud was an internally coherent document. In short, the undertakings of the Tosafists enshrined as the new reality two wholly unproven assumptions about the Babylonian Talmud. One, the notion that its language was fixed, and two, the notion that the Talmud was internally consistent. Ever since the 12th century, the study of the Babylonian Talmud has been mediated by the commentaries of Rashi and the Tosafists. Rashi's commentary, so the inside of every, I'll talk about this edition in a minute. Rashi's commentary supplies the connective tissue. This has been overly magnified, so it's actually impossible to read, mostly impossible to read. Rashi's commentary supplies, as I said, the connective tissue that gives sense to the staccato text, and the glosses of the Tosafists, his grandsons, harmonize passages that seem to be discordant. I'll just say something about this edition. This is a pretty amazing thing. This is the Vilna edition of 1880, published by the widow Rom, or Rom, R-O-M-M, Rom, and her sons. This is the, I'm going to say, canonical edition of the Talmud. This means that no matter what set of the Talmud you pick up of the classic form, whether it's small or whether it's huge, every word is going to appear in the same page in every edition. So for students of Talmud, and this is kind of a yeshiva bacher feat of virtuosity, or not virtuosity, but of pyrotechnics. If you can memorize the Talmud, which is seen as a sign of some prestige in many pockets of Jewish life, then they used to play this pin game. Does anybody hear about the pin game? And this is reported from not Shtetlach, but cities in Eastern Europe. I have done a little bit of research on this, and evidently this really, really happened, although it seems like a tall tale to me. They would bring the two greatest yeshiva bachers, who are probably, pubescent males, together in the marketplace, and they would pick a tractate, and they'd say, okay, Yevamos, right, Yebamot, I don't know why I picked that, let's pick a different, Kiddushin, betrothal. And they'd say, okay, open the book at random. All right, it's page 24b. Okay, now 5 lines down, 6 letters from the right, stick a pin in. Okay, what is that letter? And then one would say, and then the other thing was, well, what's the letter on the other side of the page? Okay, that's a whole other topic which I myself have never fully gotten my head around, why this kind of cachet has been so powerful within the Jewish community. It's really a subject for inquiry. But the fact that the Talmud is standardized certainly helps with memorization, because if any of you have ever picked up one book and you knew exactly where your favorite passage was, and then you picked it up in a different edition, it's not the same thing. This becomes really part of you. Okay, the Talmud-centered projects of Rashi and the Tosafos did not merely transform perceptions of the Babylonian Talmud. They affected the nature of pedagogy, of classroom etiquette, of social hierarchy, and even economic development. All these changes are telegraphically communicated in a lament by 2 scholars of 13th century Normandy, rabbis Moshe and Shmuel Schneur of Evreux. And I'm not going to read, you can read it to yourselves. I'm just going to go over the most important points. In highly stylized language, these brothers refer to a recent upheaval. Prior to this time, they write, greatest respect had been accorded to masters who were trusted links to the past. But this social hierarchy has been overturned because Jewish students have come to rely on written texts. And here's that great line, for books and compositions and commentaries, they are now those that teach us. The ability to analyze a written text, say these brothers, has come to be prized more than erudition, more than internalization of tradition. And young casuists, those who engage in dialectical reasoning, these young casuists who are lacking in life experience are acquiring the esteem that had formerly been reserved for seasoned repositories of tradition. With logical acuity, the new key to institutional prominence, new rabbinic academies were springing up all over, each one headed by a young dialectician. In short, the very locus of religious authority had shifted. Written texts, and those most adept at teasing new meanings from them, now commanded greater respect than living tradents, or links in the chain of transmission. The labors of the Tosafists also brought into being a third widely held assumption about the Babylonian Talmud, the notion that, I think I'm going over. I can stop before getting to a totally different, if we could talk about this. I'm going to tell you what this is, and then I will tell you what you're going to miss, which we can talk about in question and answer if you like. The labors of the Tosafist also brought into being a third widely held assumption, the notion that it is a prescriptive text, a blueprint for living a Jewish life. This perspective only gained traction once the relationship between two sources of authority, custom, embodied in behavior, mimesis, right, imitation, what you have witnessed, what was passed on to you through oral tradition, and text, right? These two modes of transmission, oral and written, they were not in harmony. in many cases. And the Tosafists acknowledged it, and they helped to harmonize those discrepancies. So I'll just finish this sentence and then tell you what the last part might be about. As the force of custom as an orally transmitted source of authority was very strong among the earliest Jews of medieval Northern Europe. But as the Talmud's text grew more familiar and the textualization process led people to place greater faith in the text's authority, it was hard to ignore the discrepancies between Jewish communal practices, the legacy of pious ancestors, living embodiments of tradition, and the dictates of the Talmudic text. It was the Tosafists who acknowledged these incongruities and they who reconciled the two. Through artful deployment of dialectical reasoning, they explained that the practices that seemed to be deviant were in fact aligned with Talmudic dictates. This particular project of harmonization firmly established that the Talmudic text was an inescapable referent. Within a matter of generations, it was hard for Northern European Jews of Ashkenaz to imagine that the Talmud had ever been regarded as anything but the definitive blueprint of Jewish law. So I'm going to skip, oh, that was terrible anyway. I'm going to just bring this, I'm leaving out an entire section, but it's okay, it had a coherence as it was. This is the MetLife, this is Siyum Hashas, or the conclusion of the study of the 6 orders and the 63 tractates of the Talmud that took place at MetLife Stadium. It says MetLife over there, but you can't really read it. Oh, thank you. And 100,000 ultra-Orthodox men attended because they had completed collectively the study of Daf Yomi, or the daily page of Talmud. This also deserves a great deal of anthropological inquiry. It by no means representative even of ultra-Orthodoxy. And those who, there was a kind of pageantry about who got to sit where. Much is to be said about this, but I think I've said enough as it is. So thank you for your patience, and I'd be happy to entertain questions and comments. Thank you. Do you want to? Okay.
I want to thank you on my own behalf, but I know that there's questions out there. Anybody want to start? Please.
Yeah, the question I have.
I'll repeat it.
Okay. The development of the Babylonian Talmud at the Academies at Surah and Pendanitha, that would be all oral at that time?
Right. Yes. You all heard the question. Surah and Pumbedita were the academies in Sasanian Iran that were more or less close to what later became Baghdad. Okay, so in the time of the Mishnah, the sages did not rely on written texts. Of course, they knew the Torah. But in every classroom, and this is from the year 30 before the Common Era, let's say, to 200 of the Common Era, Roman Palestine. Because of their insistence on keeping oral Torah oral, what they had in the room were memorizers. They were called Tanaim. Tana is the Aramaic for the word sheni, or lishanot, means to recite, to say a second time, from the word like a chad shnaim, right? So the Tana was a human tape recorder. These were not people who were renowned for their great intellects or powers of inference. They were known for their ability to reproduce authentically conversations that had taken place in the academy on an earlier occasion. So, for example, while the sages of the Mishnah are sitting around and discussing a particular matter, suddenly they say, well, wait a minute, or sages of the Talmud in Surah, Pumbedita, blocking on the name of the third, Surah, Pumbedita, it'll come to me, the other third academy, they will bring a Tana into the room. They'll say, okay, could you please replay for us that exchange, the controversy between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. And then the person, like if any of you remember Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury's story, where somebody becomes the embodiment of Jane Eyre or whatever, when that's the temperature at which paper burns, right? It's dystopian story, recommend it. You've all read it, I hope. But that's what a Tana was. A Tana was somebody who could come in, replay the conversation. And it does seem that the Amoraim, the sages of the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, but from 200 to 500 of the Common Era in Sasanian Iran, that they did the same thing. So that there's preservation of, and even they engaged in dialectical reasoning, because they would say, well, in this case, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva seem to be arguing over X. And Rabbi Akiva says it's not good, and Rabbi Yishmael says it is good, but it's the opposite in another place. And then they say, oh, no, but in this case, they really weren't talking specifically about that circumstance, right? So the process of dialectical reasoning in order to harmonize was certainly not born in the 12th century. But yes, the Talmud is transmitted orally. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question.
Do we have other questions?
Yes, there's one in the back, yeah. Yes, right on the, yeah.
First, a comment to Dr. Marks. You are a curator of precious gems, and we thank you for bringing us another wonderful scholar today. And a question for Dr. Fishman. At the very end, you talked about discrepancies that the Tosafists found between the present custom and this recorded tradition. Off the top of your head, can you think of an example or two?
I can. Okay, but the question is, can I say it quickly? I'll try. Okay, here's a really amazing one. Please remember that the Mishnah, as the foundation of the Talmud, reflects conditions in pagan Rome. Okay, the Romans are pagans, and they celebrate all sorts of pagan holidays, some of which we still, right, Bacchanalia, Juvenalia, right, got that? And the Talmud says that there may be no economic intercourse of any sort between a Jew and a pagan on the day of a pagan holiday, 3 days before or 3 days after. Now, why is that? Because it is to be assumed that if a Jew is either buying or selling, if he's selling something prior to the pagan holiday, it may be used as an accoutrement of idolatry, and that must be avoided. And if the Jew engages in some kind of economic exchange afterwards, it's possible that either the product he's purchasing or the money that is being paid to him was somehow tainted by involvement in idolatrous practice. And so in order to steer clear of idolatry, this rule is established very bluntly. No economic exchange, commercial exchange on the day of the holiday, 3 days before, 3 days after. Fast forward, Christian Europe, hello. Sunday, 3 days before, 3 days after. Whoa, are you telling me that the Jews are not? The Jews are engaged, their very livelihood is dependent upon the role that they play economically in the Christian environment. If they don't engage with Christians, there ain't enough Jews in any one place for them to be self-sufficient. So what are they going to do? Are they going to stop? Okay, let's say maybe they didn't buy and sell on Sunday, okay? But what about the other 6 days of the week? The Talmud, so here they are. They're already, the big fairs of the Middle Ages. They're engaging in commerce all the time. And suddenly somebody says, uh-oh, look at what the Talmud says. So they have to do some fancy footwork. Well, the easiest way to do the fancy footwork, I think you and I would agree, is to say, well, Christians are not pagans, okay? Except that wasn't something that the medieval Jews wanted to really claim. That is to say, because this is the only form of Christianity in their world, of course, is Catholicism. Because there's genuflection, because there's statuary, because there is the perception that, well, I won't even talk about what the divinity or the claimed divinity of Jesus. The point is, they see this as idolatry, plain and simple. So they have to do some really fancy footwork, and there are about 3 different answers to, I'll give you one, really the one that I remember best, is that one of the Tosafists, it's not mentioned, but in the Tosafists' commentary on this passage, you may not engage in commerce, on their days, on their celebratory days, 3 days before, 3 days after. It says, well, that was really only a reference to the 7 Canaanite nations who were in Canaan at the time of Joshua's conquest. Right? Right? In other words, you have to make it work. You have to make it work. And that would be an example. Sure.
Next question?
Well, I've spoken long enough, so I want to thank you for being a receptive audience. Thank you.